counseling, I'm now ready to render my diagnoses. My friend and our co-laborer in the Lord, Pastor Ian Boyd, is a textbook example of someone that is a glutton for punishment. He is into pain. There can be no other explanation for it. I offer to you this body of evidence, my preaching assignments this first year here at Trinity. And I can remember after I had accepted the call and we were making preparations, Ian and I were in communication at least once or twice a week. And I asked, well, what are we going to be preaching on when I get moved down there? And he writes back, the book of James, here's your assignments. I'm thinking, wow, James. So a text that talks about money and rich people and your tongue and your mouth and everything else. I'm like, well, that's a good place to start. Most people like to wait, 5 years or more to get to that book, but we'll start there. And then as the assignments unfolded throughout the year, I noticed that the gospel readings that were at the intersection of faith and politics usually ended up in my box, and just began to notice a little pattern there. I can have no doubt that I am correct in my assessments, and so that today my brother in Christ, my co-laborer in the faith, has asked me to preach on the Song of Solomon, 2 verses 8 through 13. Song of Solomon, I tell you. A book that's about two people who are in love and dying to spend, let's call it some quality time together as a couple. I can only guess that this is yet another test if I can keep my alter ego, Captain Sensitivity, at bay. But today I intend to give him the ball and just block for him and let him go. See what happens. But seriously, all kidding aside, we find ourselves this morning in the midst of a neglected book of the Bible, and we could have a show of hands this morning, and very few people would raise them and say, yes, I've actually heard a sermon on the Song of Solomon, or the Song of Songs. Most of us have not. But yet this has been an important book throughout the history of both Judaism and Christianity. In fact, it plays a central role. So why is it neglected? Well, Song of Songs, as the book actually is called, is a work of love poetry. There's no way around it, no way to hide it. More than likely, it was penned in commemoration of Solomon's marriage to an Egyptian princess. This was a big moment in Solomon's life, a big moment in the life of Israel. And it has all that would be in love poetry. It's vivid, it's imaginative, it's full of word pictures and double entendres, so to speak, and all kind of things that would be impolite to speak of in society. However, all of this vivid imagery drawn from nature, fertile places like gardens and blossoming flowers, all of these different ways that the ancients used to describe feminine sexuality, this is poetry at its best. This is using vivid words and images to woo the heart of one's beloved. I'm instantly reminded of that scene in Dead Poets Society where Robin Williams strides two desks and he's telling a group of young men the purpose of language. And he says, avoid using the word very because it's lazy. A man is not very tired, he is exhausted. Don't use very sad, use morose. Language was invented for one reason, boys, to woo women. And in that endeavor, laziness will never do. Obviously, Solomon, who had 700 wives and 300 concubines, understood that truth long before Robin Williams had stood and described it and given it to a group of men who needed to hear it once again. We can say what we like about Solomon. He was misguided, dare I say it, exhausted. But he was definitely not lazy in his pursuit of women. So the question we should have at this point is what is this text about? What's going on here? So it's kind of striking that within Judaism, boys, unless they are age 15, are actually not even allowed to read the text. So Whistler family, I don't even know if we actually should have allowed that this morning, but nevertheless, it is what it is. So the text is very much, I was just now pointing out to Ian that in all actuality, the text really should probably begin with verse 7 and end in chapter 3, verse 5, because there's two little snippets there that kind of highlight what's going on. The author says, I adjure to you, O daughters of Jerusalem, by the gazelles and the does of the field, that you not stir up or awaken love until it pleases. And then that same refrain is repeated. And so then you have this big kind of anticipation and teasing moment played out before you. So you've got the beloved coming to look for his bride, to bid her to arise, to come out, to play, to come out. It's spring. The time for love has arrived. But she's being ever so coy, ever so hard to get, so that the beloved is having to scale the latticed wall and to look through the ventilation holes to look for his beloved, and she's simply going from ventilation hole to ventilation hole to ventilation hole, running, hiding, not wanting to be caught, until finally he's gone, and the refrain returns, awaken not love until it pleases. Moral of the story, don't tease. That's what it is. It is really that simple. This is that kind of story. This is that kind of book. It can't be avoided. It can't be shushed away. It can't be covered up. It can't be ignored. This is what God has for us this morning. What is going on? How does a book that is not only so obviously about romantic love, but about a physical expression of that love in the sexual union, come to play such a pivotal role in the history of both Judaism and Christianity? The Song of Songs belongs to that part of the Hebrew Scriptures that we call the writings. You have the law and the prophets and the writings. These are the youngest parts of the Hebrew Bible. And despite their young age, books like Daniel and the Proverbs and the Song of Solomon and Ecclesiastes, despite their young age, the Judaism at the time of Jesus, these writings played a pivotal role because these are kind of explanation writings. You've got the law and the prophets that tell you what God has said, and you've got the writings that kind of tell you how to live that out. It's the application of God's passage, so to speak. This is how you do this. This is what it looks like. And so they played a pivotal role in the mindset of God's people. And Judaism saw in this story implications of God's covenant promises. And they saw in the Song of Songs a picture of God's pursuit of Israel as his people. Now, they did this without ever losing that physical and natural and literal reading of the text. They always understood what this was, what was being said here, hence why they don't allow the young men to read it until they are 15 in Orthodox circles. That's just kind of a coming of age ceremony. It's the time they also would get married, so it was appropriate reading at the time. This was a natural reading. These were good things. Judaism saw a typology there, and that's very important for us this morning, but they never lost sight that primarily this was about the anticipation and the pursuit of one's beloved for sexual intimacy. But this relationship between typology and allegory is one of the first things we've got to see this morning. You see, on the surface, an allegory and a typology to most of us are fairly similar, but they are very different rhetorical devices, very different ways of reading a text. Now, what they both have in common is that they are not the literal or the natural reading of a text. They both are getting something from a text that is not necessarily there on the surface level. But they differ in this way. Typology is a very formal device. So you have types, and you have this other thing called an antitype, what we would call the fulfillment of that type. And those exist across a body of literature. So it's very easy to go from the story of Song of Solomon and his princess, his Egyptian princess, to a story of God pursuing Israel in love as his people. That's a very easy type and antitype relationship. And so in Judaism, that makes a lot of sense. Well, that's picked up in Christianity as well with the language of Christ and his bride, the church. Again, a type and antitype relationship. That's a very solidly defined way of reading a text. And the way that works is that the way the type and the antitype are related, it's kind of latent, kind of pregnant within the text. You can see it in some way, shape, or form. It's not a surprise, so to speak. However, an allegory is a very different type of rhetorical device. Allegory was devised by the Greek philosophers as a way to salvage all of the old stories about the Greek gods that were used to teach all kind of things. So the philosophers wanted to instruct people about morality and about how to live in the world. So they took all the ancient stories of Hercules and Achilles and all these great tales, and they would retell them in such a way to teach morality, even if it had nothing to do with the text whatsoever. When you read through some of the philosophers' works on this, that's what you see. They make all these points and make all these claims that have absolutely nothing to do with the text. They're in no way, shape, or form related to the text whatsoever. And this was very, very popular in intellectual centers like Alexandria. So as the church spread, that type of that type of reading of the text found its way into Christianity. So for a long period of time, the Song of Songs began to be read in an allegorical fashion, so that all that was in the text was Christ and the church. And the very physical and natural reading of what was going on between Solomon and this Egyptian princess is lost. Not only lost, but denied. And said you cannot read the text in that fashion. Now, I am not Derrida, so I am not going to offer a complete genealogy of how this happened this morning, but I will point out a few things that are important for us as Western Christians. Many of you will know St. Augustine. But what many of you may not know is that St. Augustine, prior to coming to know the Lord, was a very, very sexually immoral person. He maintained a mistress with him for the majority of his life prior to coming to know Christ. But he wouldn't marry this mistress because he was engaging in all types of other sexual immorality that highlighted life in the ancient world for someone of his stature. You and I would look at all of this and be like, wow, how was this person a famous teacher? But this was just the morality of his day. This is what he was caught up in. But Augustine began an intellectual and spiritual journey that ended with him becoming a Christian, but there were some steps along that way. First, he became a Neoplatonist. Then he became a Manichaean. Both of these philosophical systems have something in common. They're both Gnostic, and they're both dualist. That is, there's a very hard division between the spiritual world and the physical world, and they're both Gnostic, which means the spiritual world is very good, this physical world is very bad. So this is kind of the framework with which Augustine begins to think, even before he becomes a Christian. Now, I'm not trying to say that Augustine remained a dualist or Platonist throughout all of his life. I'm just simply saying that this was in the water in which he was drinking the Christian faith. So as he became a Christian, he realized that his life of sexual morality had to be set aside. But instead of following the biblical example of maybe marrying the mistress that had given birth to his son, he just simply dismisses her and then leaves for North Africa with his mother and his son. I think both of which who actually died on the journey, if I'm not mistaken. He always was, and perhaps rightfully so, very, very afraid of his own lustful appetites. To the point that he became oppositional to sex, sometimes even within the Christian confines of marriage. Sex became something dirty. And unfortunately, this persevered in the Christian faith in some circles, even to this day. To bring it a little closer to home within our little branch of Western Christianity here in the United States, you have the Puritans, who were masterful, literal interpreters of the Bible everywhere except Song of Solomon, where all of a sudden they became allegorists that could rival all the great Greek philosophers of the ancient world. They never saw anything between Solomon and an Egyptian princess. It was always Christ and the church. That's the way you did it, and that's how it was done. And we all know the textbook definition of a Puritan is a person that is afraid that someone somewhere is having a good time. And they saw in Song of Solomon that Solomon may have been having a good time, and hence this had to be blocked from public view. I'm also reminded of there's a famous American bishop, and I can't think of his name, who right after the American Revolution, so this is early on, when all Presbyterian ministers would have been very close relatives of the Puritans, he had this to say about some ongoing moral dispute. He said, listen, a Presbyterian minister can do anything that an Episcopalian minister can do, he just won't enjoy it. So, again, that brings us to kind of how we are in the West as Christians. And this reading of Song of Solomon was very much cemented into the fabric of American fundamentalism and unfortunately made its way even into American evangelicalism. For a long time, this was simply how you read Song of Solomon. If you got up and you preached on it at all, you preached on Christ in the church. But fortunately, I would say in the last 20 years or so, maybe a little longer than that, there's been a big turn. There's been a acceptance that no, this is what it is. This is love poetry. Let's preach on it as part of God's Word and see what it can teach us. So there has been a turn recently towards getting back to that. President of the seminary that I went to wrote a book on this called God on Sex, which is just an ongoing commentary with Song of Solomon. And it's kind of, his attempt to work through recovering this and finding a way to talk about this, without it being embarrassing or shaming or anything like that, to get to that point. And it's a good book. I recommend it to you. It's by Donnie and you would enjoy it. So why is it important for you and I to recover this natural reading of this text? Why is this important? Well, I think it's important for many reasons, but I want to highlight a couple of you that I think really drive home this point for us. One, it provides us, the Song of Songs provides us with an excellent opportunity to teach on human sexuality in a positive way. In our current climate, people only perceive the Christian faith on human sexuality as restrictive, as negative. And I know part of this can't be avoided because our society proclaims and lives in a sexual ethic that is contrary to the one that God has given us. But yet, we can take this initiative to teach on all that is good about human sexuality, all that's right about it, all of it that fits together and works out, all of it that is a good and perfect gift that comes down from God. It gives us that opportunity to what it looks like to operate in a sexual morality within the boundaries that God has given us. And two, teaching on the Song of Songs gives us a chance to confront that Gnosticism that's still ever so prevalent in the dark corners of Christianity. Teaching on the song allows us to realize that Christ is reconciling the world to himself. You see, there is no the physical world is not bad. The spiritual world is not somehow better. God is reconciling those things to each other in the cross. God is bringing about what he wants for the future through the work that Christ has done on the cross. And so we can confront that kind of Gnosticism that says, "Oh, it's bad. It's bad. It's your duty." No, it's not a duty. It's a gift. It's a privilege, if nothing else. 3, teaching on the song allows us to teach that God's created order is indeed very good. Again and again, God in Genesis says, "I made such and such and it's good. And I made such and such and it's good. And on this day this was made and it's good." And finally he finishes everything. And on the 7th day he rests and he proclaims that it's all very good. And within that is this relationship laid out. He has made Adam and Eve and he has given them gender. He's given them identity. And within that, he's given them the expression of physical love for procreation, pleasure, and all that goes in it. And he has pronounced what? It's very good. It's very good. Creation is good. And not only is creation good, but implicit within the story of the creation account is the fact that there is a moral order, a way of living in the world that is tied to creation itself. It cannot be denied. And so philosophy since David Hume has made this one proclamation, that you cannot get from an is to an ought. That you can't get from being, from ontology, to doing, to action. That you can't cross that. It's also called Lessing's ditch. You can't cross that. But Christ has always said, "I am, therefore you do." He is an ought bridge. He is that, showing us that there is a moral order in the universe that is tied to the way things have been created. So yes, when we talk about gender, and we talk about sexuality, we talk about those things that God has given us in creation, there is a good and true moral order, a way of living that is tied to that. And by teaching on things like the Song of Solomon, we give ourselves opportunity to make that proclamation, which is a much needed corrective in our age where our society thinks that everything is fluid and can be constructed how they see fit. No bounds whatsoever. I would say that also teaching on the song allows us to proclaim the goodness of God. We didn't read it this morning, but the New Testament reading today is from the book of James, and it tells us that every good and perfect gift comes down from the Father of lights, in whom there is no shadow of turning, no change. God made us with a given sexual gender and identity, and from that beginning, He gave us the gift of sex for satisfaction, for pleasure, for intimacy, and for procreation. As I was preparing this week, I was reading through some commentaries, and what I came again and again was, I would be surprised. There would always be this tangent at this point in the text. They would always chase the same rabbit. So obviously you can see they're all reading each other's commentaries and just going forward. But that's how scholarship works. So they're all chasing this rabbit, and this rabbit is the use of the Hebrew word for sexual intimacy is a very simple word. It just is to know, yada. You know, if you've watched Seinfeld, you've heard yada 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 enough. That's what they're saying. That's what's going on. Just to know, and it's an unusual word because it involves intimacy and to know someone at a very deep level. But it's also the word they would use to know anything. So this is their idea of how to know someone, how to really and truly know someone, is through sexual union, through, within the confines that God has given us in marriage. This is how you know someone. So it's, it's not. It's not you and your wife or you and your husband sitting down and having a Bible study together. That's not the most intimate form of knowledge you can have of your spouse. Even worshiping together, that's not the most intimate form of knowledge that you can have with your spouse. It is in that physical union in which you can have the most intimate knowledge of a person. And the explanation that they all give is that it's only in that sexual union, repeated vigorously, unselfishly, without shame and inhibition, over and over again within the marriage confines, that humanity ever really gets a picture of the kind of intimacy and knowledge that exists within God in the Trinity. It's as close as we can ever hope to get. The reason being is that, God never had to create. That's a central part of the Christian religion. God didn't have to create. It was the natural overflow of His love for the Father, Son, and the Spirit, in how they knew each other. In that intimate Trinitarian bond, the natural outflow of that was love. Love creates. Hence, the physical union of man and woman doesn't always end in creation, but it can. That is how we imitate God. That is part of being created in His image. So that in this union, there is that possibility in which we can most mimic God in His creative ways. So this is a big deal. This is something for us to understand, that God has given us a fantastic gift, and it's a gift that we should not be ashamed of as long as it is done within the confines that He has laid out. So we clearly see that the natural and literal reading of this song is important. But are we also right to look for something else here? Are we right to look for a bigger picture, so to speak? Something else in addition to this literal reading? I believe there is a solid reason for us to do so. I think that there is a type and antitype relationship here between Christ and the church and Solomon and his Egyptian princess. The song, of course, is written within the context of marriage, and marriage is one of St. Paul's favorite metaphors, so to speak, to describe Christ's relationship with His bride, the church. It's one of His go-to phrases. And in this word picture that we see again and again, if you were to lay the picture of the bride of Christ and Christ beside Song of Solomon, what you would see is that Christ is always the bridegroom. He's the one pursuing his beloved. He's the one that leaps the mountains. He is one that bounds the distances. He is the one climbing the wall, holding on to the lattice, looking for his beloved. He is the one looking with a deep desire, a deep longing, a zeal, a jealousy that you can clearly see. Christ pursues us with that same passion. In fact, it's a passion that far exceeds that of Solomon for his Egyptian princess. Jesus is in love and is jealous for us. He desires us. This is not a misreading of the text, as long as we always remember that Solomon and his princess are here as well. The takeaway for us today is for us to examine our own relationship with Christ and ask this question. Is it full of passion and desire and zeal? And if not, who's to blame? We know that Christ pursues us with zeal and with passion. Maybe we, much like Solomon's princess, are being far too coy, far too hard to get. We can walk away this morning affirming that yes, there is a book in the Bible. You can go back and tell your friends at lunch today, there's a book in the Bible that is almost exclusively dedicated to the sexual pursuit of a married couple. And it's vivid and wild, and you couldn't write anything today that would be any better. We can acknowledge that this is a gift from God. He gave it to us. We have a picture because of it of what life is like within the Trinity itself. But we can also walk away with a word